Today, Dr. DeMarco is going to discuss the rights of Mother Earth, and following her presentation, we will have a book signing. So everybody welcome Dr. DeMarco.
Well, thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful day for a book talk, right? Nobody's out digging in their gardens where they really would love to be because it's raining. So thank you for spending your part of your afternoon with me this afternoon. I always love April because that's the month where we celebrate Earth Day, and it's the month where everything stops being winter and really becomes flowers and lovely and smelling the real richness of the earth. So it's a perfect time to think about our place in the world and our place in the rights of the world. So we live on a really fragile living planet, and it brings to us everything that we need for our life support. Unlike the rock-strewn, overheated or overcold planets that fling around the universe, the planet Earth has this wonderful living system that provides the clean water, the fresh air, fertile ground, and the biodiversity of species that make life on Earth possible. And we are just one part of that biodiversity, and we depend on all of these living systems for our own well-being. But today, our living Earth is under stress from overpopulation, from fossil fuel combustion, which is saturating the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, with the resource extraction processes that scour things from the earth and leave huge scars, and with the hyperconsumption that has become our daily life. We use way more than the planet can replace. If everyone on the planet lived the way we do in this country, it would take 5.5 Earths, and we have only one. So we need to put in perspective how we balance our needs with the needs to sustain the living Earth that is our home. And we are really part of the large web of life. This, I'm not going to read to you, but this is Rachel Carson's words about our interconnectedness to the living things. We don't stand alone on this planet. We are really dependent on all the other creatures that we share this earth with. And if you look at the state of the ecosystems of the earth as they are today, this is the findings of a United Nations Environment Program study on the status of biodiversity globally. We have about a third of it transformed or destroyed, mostly by buildings. There's about a third that's been fragmented or disturbed. For example, in forests where they've divided up for fracking, they've made corridors and roads in between places that were formerly wilderness. Even the rest of the planet, a third is infected by pollution that drifts across borders and by invasive species who travel all around and disrupt the ecosystems of native areas. So we are really facing two existential crises in our 21st century, one being climate change and the other being global pollution. Both of these have their origin in the way people have used and developed materials and extracted from the ground and then had the pollution accumulate. We have not taken care of sequestering back our garbage. Most of nature goes in cycles, and we go from raw material to trash. So it's beginning to pile up and affect us in ways that had not been intended. And this has become the mark of the age of man, the Anthropocene. You know, that we are seeing species extinction at an accelerating rate, and we've been experiencing a degraded environment in many parts of the world, even parts of the world that were formerly okay, like many parts of our country are now experiencing a degradation in environmental quality as we have failed to contain the effects of pollution. And if we have sustainability as a goal, that means that you need to balance the economy, the society, and the social and cultural values with the environment and the living system values. Now, if you were to look at this circle, this system, and draw it as it actually is, instead of an idealized balance, you would need to make the economy circle so big that it practically obliterates everything else, because we only measure dollar impact gross domestic product, dollar, dollar, dollar motivation. We have not placed equal value or essential weight on things that are not monetized. So some of the things that make life most precious are not counted when we count what means to be successful or means to have progress. And this is a place where we can begin to exercise our judgment on our way forward. So I like to think of the concept of sustainability. There have been many definitions about it, and they've evolved considerably much in the last few years. But the original one, written in the Brundtland Commission in 1985, talking about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. And I really think that forward thinking of responsibility for the next generation is really critical in our time right now. This is a picture of my little granddaughter, Leah. She and my daughter are currently in the Galapagos Islands on spring break, taking wonderful pictures. But Leah, this was an afternoon of achievement in her life. It's the first day she made a loaf of bread by herself. And she called me up. She was all excited and sent me a picture. And she said, "Mimi, I spent all afternoon making a loaf of bread and it came out perfect. And the boys ate it in 15 minutes." So I would like to have her children and her grandchildren live in a kind of a world where they could make bread from hand because the grains are abundant and we have the community available to transfer skills from generation to generation. So you need to think about the existential challenges that we're facing in terms of the global imperative for all of the children everywhere to have an expectation of the future, and also it's an intergenerational imperative. We have experienced the benefits of the sacrifices of our parents and grandparents, and we need to make sure that our children have the opportunity to have a future. So you have to think about that interconnectedness that Rachel Carson talked about. The rights of the living earth include the diversity of plants, animals, microorganisms. They all have a right to exist. And the human habitat destruction that's going on is obliterating many, many places where the little creatures of the world that we may not have even identified and counted are being severely stressed. And hundreds of species are being driven to extinction because we don't even know that some of them are there. This is the piping plover. And if you ever go to the beaches in Virginia, like in Chincoteague, they have large areas roped off and say, please don't walk on the beaches because they're little tiny and they look just like pebbles. Their nests are in little mounds of stones. You could stomp over them and not even know they were there, So especially driving ATVs on the beach, horrors, just horrors. So you have to think about also in terms of the international picture, the top 10% of the richest people in the world create half of the pollution of the world. And the bottom 50%, poorer countries, only contribute 10% to the global problems of warming. So there's a huge disparity in the impact and the effect. So if you're looking at how we can begin to address our global problem, we who are the largest causer of the problem have to take a greater responsibility for finding the solutions and implementing them. And we in America are about 6% of the world's population, and we consume about 34% of the world's resources, typically in a manner that it takes raw material and turns it to trash as rapidly as possible. That drives the consumer price index, the consumer confidence. If consumers are buying things, then we're doing well, right? Well, what we're doing is we're doing a very rapid race into oblivion. And you have a growing awareness of the disparities in locational effects, because the greatest causes of pollution are in the northern hemisphere, in the industrialized countries. But the largest effects, especially of resource extraction, are occurring in the southern hemispheres, especially in the areas around the equator, where you have evergreen forests and areas that are really the lungs of the earth. These are areas that are being cleared for things like palm oil and other kinds of resources that are turning forested areas that are very diverse into single crop areas for economic gain. And you also have the geographic disparities of impact. All of the cities on the coast of the US beginning now understand much better that climate change is real and it's happening to us. This isn't something that's just happening on the other end of the world or somewhere where you don't see. When we have our own cities now inundated, we have climate refugees in the United States. It's called the petrochemical industry. It's moving out of Houston and Baton Rouge and New Jersey shores into the inlands of Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia. Climate refugees of a different kind are also affecting migration away from farmlands where there has been long periods of drought. And then this last winter, when we had large parts of the heavy farmland of our own country flooded, we're going to have impacts here in our country from those kinds of changes. And we need to look at the irreversible changes that are happening because of actions that are either taken or not taken today. They play out for another generation or more. And we need to address the needs of people. We have to stop being so concerned with the needs of corporations and profits alone. This is some images of Guatemala, where they have had more than 5 years of drought, so that much of the farmland has caused lack of food, famines, lack of water, whole farming communities where they were really dependent on agriculture for much of their economy is just dried up. The cattle are dying, the people are leaving, and they arrive at our borders seeking asylum and assistance, and they're treated like criminals. Climate refugees. When you have 5 years of drought, your social systems are not going to sustain themselves. And we have this on our horizon in our own country. This kind of treatment needs to begin to penetrate our ethical consciousness of common treatment of humanity as people. How can we help meet the needs of our common fellow humans and fellow creatures of the earth in a way that we can sustain? And the obstacles to change are really deeply entrenched, aren't they? You know, we have a growing awareness that climate change is a critical issue. I mean, we're now up to something like 69% of the general population at large believes that climate change is real. And even if you divide it along party lines, you have more than 50% on all sides that are looking at this as something that needs to be addressed. But the jurisdictions over the issue are fragmented. There's no coordinated action at the federal, state, or local level. You have multiple agents of action, and they're not working together. And there's no focus on system solutions. We get caught up in fuel switching and in single subsidy programs. We're not looking at how the whole system fits together and how we can make it work better. So that's what I want to share with you a little bit today. And you look at times when we've had large movements of change, like the first Earth Day. That happened not because everybody suddenly was much more Earth conscious. It was that public values and attitudes were shaped all at the same time by a series of events that were publicized and amplified on top of each other. The Cuyahoga River caught on fire. Okay, there was a huge oil spill in Santa Barbara. Well, it's small by today's standards, but in those days it was pretty shocking, and it was right outside of the campus of the University of California at Santa Barbara, and the students there were just outraged. And we had a large movement of people coming out into the streets. They estimate about 10 million people marched all over the country on the first Earth Day. and they're galvanized by the steelworkers in collaboration with environmental people, standing up for workers' rights, for health and safety of our communities, and for the health and safety of our children's future. And that took a massive wave of effort because people could see that there were ways forward that didn't have to be so polluting and so dangerous. So today we are kind of inert, we're numb. We've had such an inundation of such endless bad news that, you know, the next big disaster hardly even makes a blip, doesn't even get news coverage. We don't have a common source of story. You used to have everybody listen to Walter Cronkite, right? Everybody listened to the same news in the evening, 11 o'clock, and you turned it off and went to bed, right? But now you have diverse sources of information. You don't have to listen to anything you don't agree with. And you don't have to listen to anybody that you don't know. So you have less of a cohesive story about how we go forward. And we don't see the costs. The price does not reflect the environmental damage to ecosystems when you buy something made of plastic. It doesn't reflect in the price of your gasoline or your car what happens to the earth from the drilling and the disposal of the wastes. Air pollution, health effects, we don't count those in the cost of the products that we use. So the consumers don't get a direct signal about the impact of their actions. And corporations are not people. Corporations don't breathe, they don't bleed, they don't have children, they really don't care about anything other than the profits of the next quarter. And if you look at the needs of real people, a plan for a transition has to take account of what happens to the workers in industries that we are moving away from. You have to think about that. This is a picture of my friend Charlie McAllister. He and I were on the street corner during the Clean Power Plan hearings that happened in Pittsburgh. And there were 3,500 mine workers and union people marching down the streets. I'll show you their picture in a minute. And there were about a couple hundred environmentalists with baby strollers and signs. And Charlie held up this sign and he said, "As long as blue union jobs are pitted against green earth health, we are all doomed." I said, "Charlie, we have to get the labor and environment people working together again, like they did in the first Earth Day, because these are common problems. These are not labor versus environment problems. These are not jobs versus saving clean air. This is saving our living Earth so that we all have a way forward. This isn't about who we're doing away with. It's about finding a way that we can accommodate a way forward that keeps people intact." So the miners that were marching, I actually pulled several of them aside and we were talking to them, and they said, "You know, if there are no coal miners coming up in the industry, who's going to pay for my pension? And you know that we're sick from the first week we've been in the mines. We need health care, because if we don't have health benefits, we're going to die." And this is the concern that they have. You can't focus on switching fuel without looking at the whole constellation of issues that are associated with that, and look at how you can take that fear of change and turn it into something positive. So we need a plan for a sustainable economy instead of a fossil-based economy. And planning for the future means we have to have a good vision of what's the pillar on the other side of the bridge. Otherwise, you just have a gangplank into a river full of alligators. And this is not a question of technology. This is more a question of ethics. It's a question of caring about each other and caring about the next generation. The technology is not the barrier. The technology is not the problem. The availability of solutions is not the problem. It's our willingness to make a change to something different. The laws of nature are not negotiable. We can argue about what sort of policies we adopt. We can make rules all we want. The laws of nature and chemistry, biology, and physics will prevail. When you increase the amount of atmospheric CO2, the atmosphere is going to get warmer. When you increase the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved into the ocean, it's going to become more acid. These are laws of our universe that we do not legislate, and we have to begin to live within those laws and take account of them as we make our own laws forward. So we need to listen to the voice of the living earth. The little creatures that come out and sing and have a life cycle of all their own, they have solutions. They know how to live within the bounds of their ecosystem. They know how to regenerate what they need and pass it on to the next generation. And so you look at people who have studied these kinds of things, one being Paul Ehrlich, where he drew the relationship of the impact of human people on the environment, and it was a function of population, the affluence as modified by technology. So if you have more people and they have more and more and more stuff and they're not using technology to manage their impact, then they're going to have a larger impact. So you have to look at the relationships. I know during the period of time when the economy was really going down in the 2008, 2009 period, there were demonstrations on Wall Street that said buy more stuff, wanted to get the consumer price index up. But what we really need to do is not necessarily buy more, but to live more. Buy less and live more. And of course, Rachel Carson, as a messenger and a really prescient writer about how you live in harmony with the natural world, she was arguing that you have to have a precaution in preventing pollution instead of trying to clean it up later, that living things have a right to exist, and we have a responsibility to prevent the pollution that we make from being a harm not only to the creatures of the earth, but to us as well. And she argued that future generations are unlikely to condone our lack of prudent concern for the integrity of the natural world that supports all life. And certainly things like aerial spraying of herbicides and pesticides, which still goes on to this day, are things that really call into question how we have used technology to manipulate the natural systems of the world. We have turned many things so that you have plowed from border to border and sprayed from border to border of farms, leaving no room for pollinators, and using mechanisms that depend on pesticides and herbicides in order to grow crops. Another good thinker in this whole area is Karl-Heinrich Robert, who wrote the Natural Step Framework. He came here to speak at the conference that we gave, Challenging Marcellus Shale, in 2010. It was a very provocative conference called Challenging Marcellus Shale, right at the point where it was beginning to take off. Very controversial, but Karl-Heinrich Robert argued that there's a framework that is driven around natural systems being the base for our economy and for our civilization. And he argued that you leave the fossil resources in the ground where they were and not prioritize extraction over preservation of the surface ecosystems. Most of them, like watersheds and farmland and grassland and forests, they're on the surface of the earth. If you give the rights of extraction primacy over preserving the ecosystem services, then you undermine the things that are our life support system in favor of extracting things that can be used once and don't regenerate. He argued that synthetic materials should not accumulate in the natural environment. And you look at how much of the man-made material there is that doesn't break down naturally by biological action, and it has begun to accumulate in just horrific amounts in the oceans, in waterways, in landfills, and even in people. That harvesting plants and animals should not reduce the biodiversity of the earth, should find ways to glean what we need for food in a productive way without destroying the biodiversity of the ecosystems in which we are inhabitants, and that human needs need to be met fairly for all. For the most part, we do not have a scarcity problem, we have a distribution problem. And we need to look at how we can make more equitable use of the resources of the earth so that everyone will have enough and we won't be exploiting one group of people for the benefit of other people. So this set of universal declarations of the rights of Mother Earth came from a Indigenous Peoples Conference in Cochabamba, Ecuador. And it was carried mostly by the women of that movement to the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. And these are not radical declarations. If you read them, the right for life to exist, the right to be respected, the right to regenerate through life cycles, the right to identify as a self-regulating and interrelated being. In other words, you have the right to be with your own species, the right to water as a source of life, and the right to clean air. These are universal rights that all living things need and have in common. And I think if we have a sense that we are all a community of living creatures that are interconnected, and the earth itself is a living creature, a living being who we depend upon, then you begin to understand that extracting things and using them up for profit destroys the very system that we depend on. And so it becomes kind of one of the underpinnings of our moral ethic going forward is that we defend biodiversity wherever it is. Wildlife refuges, public parks, backyards, all of these have a role to play in how we keep the living earth intact and connected to us, because you do not save what you don't love, right? So the more you can connect to the world, to the living earth, the more we're likely to preserve it and to make it valued. So the pathways forward to a sustainable future are really three. One, that we shift to a renewable energy system away from a fossil system, that we look at green chemistry as a way of making materials that we use, and that we use regenerative agriculture to restore the soil and to sequester carbon. And these are all system solutions because we have system problems. And we are not talking about a simple transition. We're talking more about a metamorphosis. Like a caterpillar doesn't grow legs and wings, it forms a chrysalis and completely redistributes its resources into a new shape, a new being with new and wonderful potential. That is what we're facing here, is a transformation of our economy, of our civilization, from a destructive, non-viable way to a way forward that can be wonderful and be a better future than the one we've known in the past. And it isn't that we have not enough to do this with. The sun provides 10,000 times more energy than we can possibly need. The 2050 projections on those two little orange balls on the far left, that is the International Energy Agency's wildest projections of demand for the world. And you see that the solar energy way swamps that. It's a matter of how we organize to collect and use it, and how we look at the problem of energy management, not so much as a fuel replacement, but as an energy use system. We do have to transform our energy system from the coal, oil, and fossil combustion mode to a renewable and regenerative system. Open pit mining, mountaintop removal of coal, these things are extremely damaging to the ecosystems that are there, and they leave permanent scars on the land. This building that you see on the right is the Forest Hills Borough building. It has a net zero energy profile, and we actually got a check for $880 from our first year of operation because we generated more power than we actually used. And this building is not an expensive building. It wasn't a wildly exotic space. It's a pretty functional little borough building, but it was designed with passive solar design, and it uses geothermal earth tube system for heat and cool, and it has photovoltaic roof. So it's a question of how you design things to use what falls on you for free, instead of assuming that you're going to have to take fossil resources and burn them to meet a need. And when you're doing a transition, they don't just happen automatically, right? So when there first were a shift from the horse and buggy days to the motorized vehicles days, there were some, collisions, there were issues that had to be resolved, right? Horses will not run into each other, vehicles not so much. When people are driving them, they don't pay attention. You had to pave the roads. You had to write rules of the roads. You had to issue licenses. There had to be a whole fuel distribution system. Instead of horseshoes and tack shops, you had now fuel stations and service stations. All of that stuff required changes of laws. You had to pave the roads because horses could walk around the mud puddles and the cars got stuck. So you need to do that kind of system analysis if we're going to shift to a different energy system. The interface between utilities, it could be a lot smoother. Some places have a very smooth interconnection process between renewable energy and the utility system. In other places, it's out and out war. This is not necessary. We can decide if we're going to make a transition, we make the rules of the road smooth. There are whole issues around insurance and financing. I had another person call me yesterday from a homeowners association that doesn't allow solar on the roofs of their homeowner association buildings. And they're going, why aren't we allowed to put on solar? Well, let's look at the rules, right? Similarly, regenerative agriculture allows us to move from a system of growing food that's dependent on chemicals and poisons to a system where the soil is enriched by agriculture and where you actually cultivate land in a way that's carbon is pulled out of the air and sequestered into the ground. It makes the ground more fertile, and it also helps to pull the CO2 out of the air by natural functions. And green chemistry is a process where you use principles that do not require combustion and toxic chemicals in order to make things, but rather you design things in a way that they are not hazardous to people and that you have a way to reuse them, repurpose them, and send them into a circular economy instead of a use once and throw away economy. And then we wouldn't have to worry about this long list of stuff we're supposed to avoid when we're shopping, right? And there are many, many lawsuits now piling up where the earth is a plaintiff and treating earth systems as persons is being challenged in the law. The one that I find most interesting is the Colorado River versus the state of Colorado over the right to have water in the lower reaches. If you don't have water, you're not a river. And the lower reaches of the Colorado are so overcommitted above that there's only a little trickle that goes down to the very end. And they have filed lawsuits for the right of the river to have water in it. And a number of these were brought by children and teenagers asking for the government to honor the law and to protect their future from climate change. There are now over 4,000 lawsuits of this kind across the country where youth, 15, 12, 13-year-old children are filing on behalf of their own future. This is one of the things that I think we need to pay attention to. The Children's Trust has brought the Juliana versus the United States case, and they will be going to trial either this month or next. The Justice Department has run out of reasons to avoid discovery. They finally have run out of, they've got a court date. So we look at the ethical principles that give us a call to action, and really the reverence for life is one of them. Our intergenerational fairness, our sense that we have to give the next generation a way forward, And the environmental and social justice aspects of this, where you cannot make people live in sacrifice zones. You cannot consider parts of our environment as disposable for the sake of generating revenue for a few corporations alone. We need to replace that linear concept that the only thing that matters is how much money you make, and look more at the dynamic equilibrium, like an ecosystem. It runs in circles. And we look at how you use materials to regenerate materials, and look at how we can turn that into a positive economic force. And we have to look at holding the land in trust for the next generation, rather than using it up as fast as possible. The concept of protecting sacred space has been part of humanity from the beginning of time. This has to be something that is part of our values, so that we can prevent this concept that, well, it belongs to everybody, so nobody has to take care of it, and we can all use it up as much as we want. Making a kind of a critical value to preserve the living part of the earth as an obligation to the next generation. And really to reestablish our sense of wonder at the absolute amazing things that go on in the world. If you take a moment to notice them, they're all around us, and they give you joy, really and truly they do. And I find that this time of year is one of the easiest times to remember that nature will regenerate itself, and we need to help that. We are part of that living life force. And the more you can connect into that living force of the earth, the more we will be able to be regenerated ourselves and have the energy to continue this battle, so that the next generation has wonderful options forward. And this is one of my students, Eva Resnick Day. She's working for the Sierra Club 100% Renewable Energy Project. I think we need to model the change we want to see, and not be afraid to find a soapbox and get on it. You have to use your voice. Talk to the people who represent you, talk to your friends, to your neighbors. And don't be afraid to demand accountability for the people who are making decisions on our behalf. Because if we don't do that, then we will get the government we deserve. If you sit here and pretend it isn't there, it's going to just go crazy without you. We need to show that people matter too, and that's where we are.